So welcome to the London Luminaries, 14 historic properties working together to share our collective heritage. My name is Ricky Pound and I'm a trustee of the London Luminaries. Well, I get the joy of welcoming our chair for the evening. She is a broadcaster and a professor of literature. It is the fantastic Professor Judith Hawley.
Thank you very much, Ricky. And thank you to all of you here tonight watching us live, and those of you who are watching us later on the YouTube channel. And I'm very excited to introduce another in our series, our fourth Luminaries series on the theme of food and drink. And our historic property tonight is absolutely the smallest of our properties. It's Garricks Temple to Shakespeare, a tiny little place on the river by Hampton. And it is hosting, though, for this evening, two giant personalities of the 18th century, the gargantuan figures of David Garrick and Samuel Johnson, who both hailed from Lichfield. Our speaker tonight is more than equal to the task of taking on these Lichfield giants. Not only is he a trustee of the Garricks Temple to Shakespeare Trust, he's an actor and an artist, and he's created many of the caricature images that you're going to be seeing tonight. So I'd like to hand over to and welcome Clive Francis.
I've been very much involved with Garricks Temple to Shakespeare for well over 20 years. In our last Luminaries get-together, I talked at length about David Garrick, as much as one can in 20 minutes, about his outstanding career as one of theatre's great iconic actors. And this evening, though, being our subject is food and drink, I'm turning the spotlight on Garrick's great mentor and friend, Dr. Samuel Johnson, who became an almost fatherly figure to the actor, and even at times could be overcritical of Garrick's acting and lifestyle. He would come down heavily on any who felt they could do the same. So why Dr. Johnson? Well, apart from being possibly the most distinguished man of letters the world has ever known, he is probably the best person to turn to when it comes to the culinary delights of the stomach. For as he said himself, there are those who have a foolish way of not minding or pretending not to mind what they eat. I, for my part, do mind. I mind my belly very studiously and what goes into it very seriously. Except perhaps a cucumber, which I believe should be well dressed with pepper and vinegar, then thrown out as good for nothing. A man who does not mind his belly will, I believe, not mind anything else. Born in Lichfield in 1709 to a poor bookseller, Johnson suffered throughout most of his life from a terrible bout of problematic health issues, including abscesses of the buttocks, weak eyes, bouts of depression, possibly Tourette's, and severe deafness in the left ear, which later sadly spread to the right. He also suffered from tics, insomnia, a death phobia, intermittent excesses of alcohol, opiates, obesity, dyspepsia, flatulence, heart failure, oh my dear, gout and scrofula, which pockmarked his face for life. So it's hardly surprising that it led him to comment, "My health has been from my 20th year a state in which there is much to be endured and little to be enjoyed." His clothes reeked of stale bread and mothballs, and it was clear that his hair seldom ever saw a brush or his wig a comb. And as Dickens says of Dr. Strong in David Copperfield, his shoes seemed to yawn like two caverns on the hearthrug. It is also said that when James Boswell first dined with Johnson, the big man roared across the table, "Give me your hand, sir. I've taken a sudden liking to you." And so a long and fruitful friendship was born. Boswell, in a sense, becoming Laurel to Johnson's ebullient, rather noisy Hardy. The great Fanny Burney once described Johnson as frequently twirling his fingers, twisting his hands, and constantly chewing, as though his whole person were in perpetual motion. Unfortunately, such twitching and grimacing prevented Johnson from obtaining a teaching position, as it was feared it might frighten the children. Anyway, so that's why he and one of his only pupils, a young David Garrick, set off for London in 1737, with only a pony and 5p halfpenny between them. Johnson left behind his wife Catherine, or Tetsie as he liked to call her, and a lady 10 years his senior, whom Garrick described as being overly fat with a bosom of more than ordinary protuberance. On reaching London, Garrick went straight to Covent Garden in pursuit of fame and fortune in the theatre, while Johnson retired to his ivory tower to concentrate upon writing the great novel or play, or in his case, it turned out to be the great dictionary. For a big man, and he was big, he was extremely overweight, not helped by quantities of rich food and excessive drinking, which he acknowledged makes a man mistake word for thoughts. It can also make a man better pleased with himself, though not necessarily more pleasing to others. Even so, he was most punctilious about what he drank and how much he drank. Remember, one night's drunkenness may defeat the labours of 40 days well employed. He labelled claret the liquor for boys. Hey, it's so weak a man may drown in it before he made him drunk. And port the mare, the drink for men. But he who aspires to be a hero, must drink brandy. Another Johnson belief was that wine mixed with orange peel was an excellent remedy for the bowels. Well, now you know. The other problem he found hard to control was his gluttonous longing for food, which began from an early age. Boswell remembers one meal in later years watching Johnson consume huge chunks of venison, followed by fowl, followed by pork, and then followed by goose, topped with a mountain of rice pudding, a dish he couldn't get enough of. And you can't get more gluttonous than that, I don't think. Anyway, gluttony, of course, being described in the modern dictionary as someone who eats and drinks voraciously, an indulgence which the Catholic Church considered one of the 7 deadly sins. If that was the case, I wonder what the Church, or indeed the Pope, would have made of a gentleman from Leicester, one Joseph Barry. Now, although this covering illustration does not actually depict Mr. Barry, it gives you some idea of how he might have looked in 1709 after devouring 6 pounds of beefsteak, followed by a pound of roast pork, 2 pounds of bread and cheese, and 2 gallons of strong beer, after which he was challenged to eating a 42-pound plum pudding. But by then his jaws had stiffened so much they would stir no further. Such a challenge, of course, would have been considered a mere trifle to the Frenchman Tarara, who on one occasion, so it is said, consumed an entire meal for 15, followed by 48 pounds of apples. His party trick being to devour live snakes, eels, lizards, puppies, and even on one occasion, I'm sorry to say, human flesh. The only problem being his gluttony made him reek something awful, a problem Johnson had to struggle with as well, once rounding on a young woman after she had accused him of smelling. "No, madam, you smell, I stink." And I fear that sweating bulk of his probably did. Occasionally, Johnson would be seen riding over to Hampton to visit David and Maria Garrick, roaring for his supper. Well, these occasions were best when it was just the 3 of them at table, as Johnson's manners left much to be desired. "For my part, I consider supper as a turnpike through which one must pass in order to get to bed." The sight of food affected him as it would a wild beast, tearing at it voraciously with bare hands and then cramming huge morsels into his mouth, talking and gesticulating all the while, food spraying in all directions, until the veins on his forehead swelled and rivulets of perspiration ran down his bulging face upon the tablecloth. He didn't often drink on these occasions, but when he did, he drank abundantly, declining the dainty glass on offer, preferring instead a large man-sized tumbler. As one biographer noted, everything about Johnson's character and manner was volatile. He never did anything in moderation. When he ate, it was voraciously, and when he drank, it was copiously. Now, according to the historian Thomas Babington Macaulay, Johnson had an unquenchable fondness for rotten meat and expired dairy, whether it be an overripe hare or a meat pie made with rancid butter. He still gorged upon it with the same violence as if it was the finest cuisine. As far as his diet was concerned, well, he did try to be very careful, but he found it difficult. He began by alternating fruit and vegetables one day with meat the next, selecting Mondays and Wednesdays as the days to eat certain types of greens, though not peas. Apparently Johnson couldn't abide peas. Even so, his weight didn't stop him belittling those around him of a similar size. When Boswell suggested that some fat people ate moderately while some thin people ate a great deal, Johnson countered, "No, sir, no, whatever may be the quantity a man eats, if he is too fat, he's eaten more than he should have done. And there's nothing more to it than that." Another regular guest to Garrick's villa was the physician and humorist Dr. Messenger Monsey. What a great name that was, who was known for his eccentricity and ill manners, which all of which amused Garrick no end, of course, but not so Mrs. Garrick, who was always a little uneasy whenever Dr. Monsey joined them at table. So it was for this reason that Garrick left his name off the guest list for a dinner party he was about to throw for the Duke of Argyll. "Oh, I suppose I'm not distinguished enough for your tastes. Is that it?" Monsey wrote to Garrick rather angrily. "No, not at all, my dear fellow, not at all. No. I would have asked you, most certainly. You know I would. But I'm afraid you're too great a scoundrel for such company. But listen, if you promise, my friend, to behave with decorum and not upset the ladies or the servants, then I would be more than pleased to include your name." Well, as it turned out, Monsey couldn't have been more charming and correct of speech and behaved meticulously. That is, until the moment Mrs. Garrick began helping her title friends to food, and in her deference to them, did not seem to notice Monsey's plate, which he kept handing up time and time again. Well, after several attempts, he eventually slammed the plate down. "Listen, you bitch, are you going to serve me or not?" Needless to say, Dr. Monsey, who lived to the remarkable age of 96, was never invited to Hampton again, much to Mrs. Garrick's relief. Garrick, too, had a problem when it came to weight. "I have been lately alarmed," he said, "upon the line of my belly. In short, I'm growing fat, having gained 2 inches in the waist. And unless Shakespeare this winter reduces me to my primitive insignificance, I shall shortly explode." Well, this was due largely to his love of food rather than that of drink, being a moderate drinker at the best of times, particularly on performance days. He once had a bad experience of going on stage drunk, an experience he would never want to repeat, so would only allow himself a crust of bread and a single glass of wine for a show, which was a marked difference to that of Charles Dickens, who on performance days would begin with a pint of champagne for tea and a raw egg in a tumbler of sherry before he walked on stage. Wow, I mean, how times have changed. Yeah, or have they? I mean, Richard Burton is reported to have sunk the occasional bottle of brandy when he was performing Hamlet at the Old Vic, without unsettling the brilliance of his performance either. I've always thought Burton was someone who might well have enjoyed the company of James Quin, one of Garrick's many theatrical rivals, who once, when travelling over Westminster Bridge, cried out, "Oh, that my mouth were that centre arch, and the river ran nothing but claret." Well, Quin was also a regular guest at Garrick's table, although Mrs. Garrick found his jokes were coarse, his temper irascible, and his love of food and capacity for deep drinking not one that ever commanded her respect. Not so her husband, who delighted more than anything to try and satisfy his friend's gargantuan appetite. Referring to Quin as his butler, Garrick would throw him the keys to the wine cellar and invite him to choose whatever burgundy he liked to accompany the highly seasoned venison or turtle that had been especially provided for him. Now, different venue altogether. Around 1770, David Garrick wrote to his business advisor, James Clutterbuck, describing what sounded to me like the dinner from hell when he and his wife were invited to dine with their neighbour, the Earl of Halifax. Now, this is strictly entre nous, Garrick wrote, but the table, which had been merrily on a roar, was interrupted by a disagreeable circumstance. Indeed, one which stopped the course of wit and humour for a whole 5 minutes. His Grace, who up to now had managed to finish off 3 plates of soup, 2 plates of salmon, and 1 of carp, including, would you believe, its head, followed by 2 dozen gudgeon, a plate of eels, a jam and raspberry omelette, strawberries and cream, pineapple pie, a handsome dram of brandy, and 3 bottles of burgundy, complained of feeling a little sick, and told us very seriously that fasting never really agreed with me. The whole meal, my dear, was not only hideously overdressed and flavourless, but served up in unscovered pewter. The wine being worse, far worse, but made somewhat superior by the quantity of dead flies seen floating upon its surface. In short, both my wife and I left rather hurriedly and rattled our 1-horse chair home as fast as possible. Then there was another oddball, Ireland's Lord Chancellor, Robert Jocelyn, who liked to serve his guests, amongst other things, puffins and pickle and badger flambe, which I'm told tastes very much like pork, though I have no desire to find out. He followed this by a fricassee of frogs, crayfish, and pigeon, and that, believe it or not, was just for starters. Anyway, having now met a few eccentrics of this period, and believe you me, there were plenty of them, like Monsieur Defoe, who in 1792 ate a banquet of tortoise, bat, rat, and mole, followed by an entree of roasted owl and a dessert of toads adorned with crickets, spiders, and caterpillars. And as an encore, if you needed one, that is, swallowed all the lighted candles around the table, allowing the audience to glimpse the flickering flames inside his throat. I can think of a much easier way of earning a living. Now, putting all this grotesqueness to one side, let's now take a glimpse at how the more affluent members of society might well have behaved. Apart from the formality of evening attire, which went without saying, there would be the formality of the seating arrangement, where ladies would be required to sit demurely at one end of the dining table, while the gentlemen clubbed together uproariously at the other. However, that all changed in the 1780s, when the Prince of Wales, copied from the French, of course, introduced promiscuous seating, where men and women were permitted to sit alternately and were expected to remain so in order not to interrupt the flow of conversation. Well, as a formal dinner could last anywhere between 3 to 4 hours, or even longer, depending on the occasion, sitting without being able to nip out to the powder room or the little boys' room could prove rather uncomfortable. So a bordeloo or a chamber pot would be conveniently placed beneath the guest's chair. One rather wittily inscribed, "Let's use this item which was sent to make some mirth is only meant. So let it be, as they have said, then we'll laugh and piss and so to bed." Apparently women's liquors hadn't been invented at this time, which made the procedure less complicated, but no less noisy and no less, yes, what need I say more? Now, a bordeloo, not to be confused with a pear tart of the same name, was shaped rather like a gravy boat, with a raised lip at one end and a handle at the other, which having been placed beneath one seat, some poor unfortunate footman would then have the unpleasant duty of emptying it. The only time a guest might be permitted to rise from the seat would be in order to raise their glass in a toast. Now, in exceptionally, and I mean exceptionally, formal circumstances, former secretary was able to sip their wine, or if he or she had challenged another by catching their eye, and that person had raised their glass in acknowledgement. This extraordinary procedure of challenging the guest would continue until the dessert course, when formality would be relaxed and everyone could imbibe at will, though I can't imagine for 1 minute Dr. Johnson adhering to this strange formality. But then I can't imagine him being invited to such a formal occasion either. Oh, incidentally, the term toast, as in drinking to one's health, comes from the 16th century practice of dropping a piece of scorched or spiced toast into your wine to make it taste better. In fact, in The Merry Wives of Windsor, Shakespeare has Falstaff demanding, "Go fetch me a quart of sack, put a toast in't." Dinner itself on these occasions was very much a social affair, and the vastness of the spread on offer, consisting of several courses, could be more than a little daunting. The first being soup or fish, followed by a course of cooked dishes such as fricassees and ragout, and finally a course of various roasts, which would be carved by the host in what has been described as an elaborate symbolic display of generosity. Also, there wasn't such a distinct separation between sweet and savoury courses as we now know it. Many of the dishes served at dinner may well have been doused in any amounts of sugar, which during the middle of the 18th century had become increasingly popular, some preferring it to salt. At the end of the first two courses, the tablecloth would be taken away, a procedure known as the first remove, and the next course would then be served. Oh, incidentally, the tablecloth was a huge piece of fabric reaching down to the floor, primarily used by guests to wipe their mouths. It wasn't until the following century that napkins, introduced by the French, of course, came into fashion and where, would you believe, highly paid specialists were hired for the sole purpose of folding them. A poorly folded napkin was seen to radiate a distinct lack of class. Clearing the table on these formal occasions involved a retinue of footmen, each walking backwards in a line around the table, the first picking up the knives, the second the forks, and so on until every item had been cleared. The removal of the cloth would then reveal a fresh cloth underneath, after which the footman's procedure would be reversed until the table had been relaid. The third or fourth course might consist of exotic pies, such as peacock, another savoury baked fare. Above all, the Georgians loved conceits. In other words, food disguised as something else, meat to look like fish or swans or vice versa. Then just before the table was cleared, at the end of the second remove, a final dish, perhaps a mock boar's head made from sponge cake, would be served up in order to rekindle the guest's interest in the final course. Now, if, like me, you enjoy a jolly good pudding, then you wouldn't have been disappointed by the dessert course, especially if quaking pudding was on offer. This classic Elizabethan dessert, which seemed to require a lot of eggs, was so called because if it be right, it was shaped like jelly. The table would also include a selection of sugar-coated fruit or sugar moulded into the shapes of fruit, as well as tiny cakes and pastries and various candied nuts and flowers. There was such a variety of dishes on offer that they required an epurn, a special china or glass, or in this case silver, display basket, which in turn became the centerpiece to the table, the wealth being judged by the delicate intricacy of its design and, of course, its height. Each course would be laid out by the servants, a bit like a buffet, and was known as service à la Française, French, of course, allowing guests to help themselves or catch the eye of a passing footman to do it for them, except it was considered rather rude to be seen actually talking to a footman or a servant, so many had to rely on whatever dish was near at hand, which by the time it got to them was usually rather cold. After dessert, the hostess, taking a nod from her husband, would politely invite the ladies to retire to the drawing room to take a cup of green tea, or black tea, which was not only more fashionable, but apparently much stronger. Or incidentally, hot chocolate, which we think of now as a late night drink, would then have been more of a food containing egg yolks, breadcrumbs, cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar mixed into a thick, grainy substance, eaten with a spoon and usually served for breakfast. Anyway, the gentlemen, having had plenty of time to smoke their cigars, pass the port around and tell any number of risque stories, would then join the ladies for a little night dancing until around midnight, when, would you believe, a small supper of cold meats and fruits would be served before the carriages arrived at 1. According to one food historian, the Romans believed it was healthier to eat just the one meal a day, believing more than one would be considered gluttonous, which may well, of course, be true, though I can't imagine enjoying it lying on your stomach being very comfortable, or indeed very healthy. But then they did have what they called a scissor slave to cut it all up for them. But anyway, be that as it may, today we regard breakfast, in other words, the meal which broke the fasting of the night, as the first meal of the day, and by the 17th century became quite an event, even to breakfast rooms starting to appear in the homes of the affluent. The origins of the word lunch, which we look upon as the second meal of the day, meant in Johnson's time as much food as any one hand can hold at any one time. Not to be confused, of course, with the Anglo-Saxon word nuntium, meaning noon drink. I suppose 11s, I suppose, a derivation of nutch, signifying a large piece of bread, which might have been what a certain lord had in mind in 1762, in order not to interrupt his game of cards, instructed his cook to prepare his food in such a way that it would not interfere with his game. Well, this inventive cook went ahead and presented John Montague, the 4th Earl of, yes, you have it, Sandwich, with as much roast beef that 2 slices of bread could comfortably hold together with one hand. In that instance, a meal, in other words, a sandwich, was born, which has continued to dominate our lives, and that of pret-a-manger ever since. Though I do rather feel sorry for the anonymous cook, as I feel it should really be named after him. Afternoon tea, as we have come to love and enjoy, didn't come into fashion until around 1840, thanks to Anna Maria Russell, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, who one afternoon, becoming despondent at the long void between lunch and dinner, requested that tea and cake be brought to her room, an afternoon ritual which soon caught on and has remained with us ever since. Not only that, but tea gardens began popping up all over the city. In 1706, Thomas Twining opened the first tea room on London's Strand, which is still going strong 300 years later. Dr. Johnson's habits, on the other hand, were without ritual, invariably dining at any hour which best suited him, a habit he kept up even when staying with his friends Henry and Hester Thrale, a couple who invited him to stay for a week and ended up staying 15 years. Mrs. Thrale, for whom it was thought Johnson had a secret passion, as he undoubtedly believed she did for him, or so he thought, would often remonstrate about having to serve him breakfast at an hour when the rest of the house were expecting dinner, which makes sense when you consider dinner around this time was usually served between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, later pushed to around 5 during the following century. But as the upper classes by the 1790s weren't rising from their beds until around 10 or even as late as noon, their breakfast hour clashed with those who had risen at a more civilized hour and were desperate now for their dinner. To confuse matters even more, when they went for morning walks in what others regarded as the afternoon, they greeted each other with "good morning," unless, of course, they'd eaten their dinner, when it became "good afternoon." Mind, none of this mattered a jot to Johnson, who, as I say, ate whenever his large body informed him. So how did this great man, the great Samuel Johnson, define food? Well, his dictionary, 1755, which took 8 years to complete, describes over 40,000 words, 2,000 of which are devoted entirely to food, which I suppose one of the most famous ones being oats, which Johnson defines as a grain which in England is given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people, which, considering that most of his assistants were Scots, I can only imagine was written with tongue firmly embedded in cheek. Boswell remembers accompanying Johnson to Lichfield, where they were served oat cakes at breakfast. It was pleasant to find, Boswell reports, that oats, the food of horses, were put to equal use feeding the people of Johnson's hometown. Now, moving even further up the scale, let's now glance at a few of the menus favoured by George II and Queen Caroline, both of whom had an apparent fondness for birds, eating them, that is, such as ortolan, lark, and blackbird, and even, would you believe, the occasional puffin. Puffin, of course, now being a long-standing delicacy in Iceland. The royal menu for Christmas Day introduces us to plum broth amongst its 20-odd courses, a variation of what we now know as plum pudding or figgy pudding, but then served as a savoury soup, which apparently had been a regular feature of the royal table from as far back as 1700. Another dish on offer was squabs and noodles, squabs being unfledged pigeons, and occasionally turtle, whose flesh, if it could get past its ethereal colour and musk-like smell, could either be salted and barrelled, peppered and baked, or reduced into a nourishing broth. Lamprey pie was another peculiar dish to set before the king, a Christmas delicacy served to every reigning monarch since medieval times, dying out, I believe, somewhere in the 1830s. Lampreys being jawless sea eels with funnel-like mouths who enjoy sucking the blood out of other fish. William the Conqueror's son, Henry, was supposed to have died from suspected food poisoning after eating one, which isn't a little too surprising. In fact, our late Queen was sent a lamprey pie in 2016 to celebrate her becoming the longest reigning monarch. Whether she ate it or not has never been recorded, although the lamprey on this occasion was sourced from Canada, as it is now a protected species in the UK. The royal turkey, it would seem, was served cold with a salad, turkeys being regarded as a rare luxury, even though they've been around since Elizabethan times. Capability Brown, the royal landscape artist, used to lock up an area around Hampton Court to breed turkeys for himself. When it was complained, he not only bred them without permission, but allowed them to stalk and damage the royal maze. Probably been a desperate effort to find their way out, poor things. Anyway, back to our dear friend, Dr. Johnson. One of his other passions was the eating of fruit, for which he had an insatiable appetite, especially peaches, which you could eat in excess of 7 each morning for breakfast. Once on a visit to Lord Sandys, he cleared an entire fruit wall, which, according to Mrs. Thrale, only strengthens the conviction that he was both a great and good man and a healthy eater. One of his favourite dishes was a good savoury meat pie, which his housekeeper, Anna Williams, would make from a 2-pound shoulder of beef covered over in puff pastry, which Johnson would take to the public oven. In other words, the baker's oven, bread, of course, not being baked on a Sunday. This is where people who lacked the facilities to cook at home would take their Sunday joints, collecting them, of course, once church was over. It was either that or they bought ready meals from Porridge Island, a narrow lane running alongside St. Martin's in the Field, which was filled with any number of food stalls for the convenience of those who couldn't be bothered to cook. So the takeaway meal of today, you see, isn't as recent as innovation as you might think. Believe me, no man ate more heartily than Dr. Johnson, said Boswell, or loved better what was nice and delicate, often saying, perhaps for my edification, that wherever dinner was ill got, there was poverty, or there was avarice, or there was stupidity, and if it wasn't well dressed, then he would suspect inaccuracy in everything else. Do not make a farce, his wife once said to him, of thanking God for a meal you're about to receive, when a minute later you're complaining of it not being edible. Drinking, he often said, deprived him of his powers of reasoning and self-control, and wanted the choice between either sobriety and knowledge or claret and ignorance. He had been known to drink up to 3 or 4 bottles of port at any one sitting, which later he denounced as being a sin against God and against humanity. I would now no more think of drinking wine than a horse would, and shall not begin to drink again till I grow old and the craving returns. In fact, it wasn't long before the craving did return, together with his never-ending thirst for tea. I must confess, I'm a hardened and shameless tea drinker whose kettle has scarcely time to cool. Dr. Johnson, retorted a lady of quality after watching him drain his 30th cup of tea, you drink too much. Madam, you talk too much and are insolent. He went out and bought himself a magnificently crafted 2-litre silver teapot, large enough to serve 10 cups of tea. In 1757, the philanthropist Johannes Hanway published an essay on the effects of tea drinking, or liquid fire, as he called it, considering it to be pernicious to one's health, leading women to suffer from a variety of nervous disorders and bouts of melancholy. Johnson, of course, refuted everything this madman was saying by claiming that the proper use of tea was to amuse the idle, relax the studious, and dilute the meals of those who cannot use exercise and will not use abstinence. I'm afraid time is now running against us. So before saying goodbye to the extraordinary Dr. Johnson, poet, essayist, moralist, literary critic, biographer, editor, lexicographer, and tea drinker, I thought I would end with a little ditty Johnson composed in honour of his favourite drink, which he recited while sitting in the company of Joshua Reynolds and friends. I pray thee, gentle Rennie dear, that thou wilt give to me, with cream and sugar tempered well, another dish of tea. Oh, do not fear, my gentle maid, I shall not long detain the cup, when once unto the bottom I have drunk the liquor up. Yet hear it last, this mournful truth, nor hear it with a frown. Thou canst not make the tea so fast as I can gulp it down. Johnson died in 1784 at the age of 75 and was laid to rest next to David Garrick in Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey. Thank you. Now, before I disappear, may I take the opportunity to tell you that Garrick's Temple to Shakespeare is open every Sunday afternoon from April to October. All details can be found here on our website, www.garrickstemple.org.uk. And if you'd like to join our merry band of volunteers, you will find all the details there as well. And if you'd like to listen or watch to other talks in our series, which I hope you will, you can find them all on the London Luminaries website. Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you very much, Clive. That was absolutely amazing.